The creature that emerged from the deeper tunnels was nothing like the dragons from human stories. Jake pressed himself against the boulder and watched in terror as the being floated through the cavern. It was massive, at least 30 feet long, but it moved through the air like it weighed nothing at all. Its body was made of what looked like living crystal, translucent and filled with swirling energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Veins of blue and white light ran through its form, growing, brighter and dimmer in steady rhythms. Where Jake expected to see wings, there were instead flowing tendrils of pure energy that rippled and sparked as they moved. The dragon's head was elongated and elegant, shaped like a crystal sculpture of some alien predator. It had no visible eyes, but Jake could feel it looking at him anyway. Energy crackled between horn-like projections on its skull, and its mouth opened to reveal rows of what looked like crystalline teeth. Jake held his breath as the creature drifted closer to his hiding spot. The very air around it seemed to shimmer with power. The glowing fungus on the nearby walls grew brighter in its presence, as if the dragon was feeding energy into them. Suddenly, the dragon stopped moving. Its head turned directly toward Jake's boulder, and he knew it had found him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the creature let out a sound that was part roar and part electrical discharge. The noise echoed through the cavern like thunder. Energy tendrils lashed out from the dragon's body, striking the boulder Jake was hiding behind. The rock exploded into fragments, throwing him across the cave floor. He rolled and came up running, but he could feel the creature following him. More energy blasts struck the ground around his feet, melting stone and filling the air with the smell of burning rock. Jake dodged left and right, using the uneven cave floor to his advantage. His smaller size and human agility were the only things keeping him alive. He dove behind another large rock just as another energy blast shattered the ground where he had been standing. The dragon was playing with him, Jake realized. If it wanted him dead immediately, he would already be vapor. This creature was hunting for sport. Jake pulled out his plasma cutter and looked at the tiny device. It seemed ridiculous to fight such a massive being with a mining tool, but it was all he had. He waited until the dragon came closer, then darted out from behind his cover. The plasma cutter's beam struck one of the creature's energy tendrils. To Jake's surprise, the tendril didn't just absorb the energy or pass through it. Instead, there was a brilliant flash of light, and the tendril was severed completely. The dragon let out a shriek of pain and surprise. The severed tendril fell to the cave floor, where it continued to pulse with contained energy. Instead of fading away, it began to crystallize into a solid form. Jake stared at the fallen piece in amazement. The dragon's energy tendrils weren't just projections of power. They were physical parts of its body, made of some kind of living crystal that could store and channel energy. The wounded dragon circled above him, its remaining tendrils crackling with increased power. It was angry now, no longer playing games. Jake realized he had learned something important, but he wasn't sure he would live long enough to use the knowledge. The creature attacked again, this time with all its remaining tendrils at once. Jake threw himself to the side, barely avoiding the coordinated strike. The energy blasts hit the cave wall behind him and brought down a shower of loose rock. Rolling behind another boulder, Jake tried to think like an engineer instead of prey. The dragon was made of crystalline material that conducted and stored energy. The plasma cutter had been able to sever one of its tendrils by disrupting that energy flow. Maybe there was a way to use that weakness. Jake studied the creature's movements as it searched for him. The energy flowed through its body in patterns, concentrating in certain areas before flowing to others. It was like watching electricity move through a complex circuit. When the dragon came close enough, Jake struck again. This time he aimed for a point where several energy streams converged near the creature's shoulder. The plasma beam hit the convergence point and caused a feedback loop that sent wild energy discharges throughout the dragon's body. The creature convulsed in pain and crashed into the cave wall. More pieces of its crystalline form broke off and fell to the ground, each one containing trapped energy that continued to pulse and glow. But Jake's victory was short-lived. The dragon's pain seemed to call to something else in the depths of the cave. An answering roar echoed from the tunnels, then another and another. More creatures were coming, drawn by the sounds of battle. The wounded dragon pulled itself away from the wall and fixed its attention on Jake with new respect. It was hurt, but it was learning too. When it attacked again, it used shorter, more controlled bursts of energy that were harder to counter. Jake found himself driven back toward the underground lake where he had first landed. The dragon was hurting him, cutting off his escape routes with precisely placed energy blasts. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of other creatures approaching through the tunnels. As he backed toward the water's edge, Jake's foot struck something hard. Looking down, he saw one of the crystallized energy pieces that had broken off the dragon. The fragment was warm to the touch and pulsed with stored power. An idea began to form in Jake's mind. If these creatures were living batteries, and if their crystalline structure could be damaged by the right kind of energy disruption, then maybe there was a way to turn their own power against them. He grabbed the crystal fragment and examined it quickly. The energy inside was contained but unstable, like a battery that was overcharged and ready to release its power all at once. If he could find a way to cause a resonance cascade in the crystal matrix. The dragon attacked again, and Jake was forced to jump into the lake to avoid its energy blast. The cold water shocked his system, but it also gave him an idea. Water conducted electricity, and these creatures were essentially living electrical systems. Swimming underwater, Jake positioned himself near the lake's center. When the dragon moved over the water to attack him, he surfaced and threw the crystal fragment as hard as he could. His aim was perfect. The fragment struck the creature's central body mass. The result was spectacular. The fragment's contained energy reacted with the dragon's internal energy matrix, causing a cascade failure throughout its crystalline structure. Lightning arced across the creature's body as its own power turned against it. The dragon crashed into the lake with a tremendous splash. Its body convulsed once, twice, then went still. The energy flowing through its crystal form faded to a dim glow, and Jake knew it was dead. But his triumph was short-lived. The sounds from the tunnels were getting closer, and he could see more blue light approaching from multiple directions. He had killed one dragon, but there were others, and they had heard the battle. Jake swam to shore and picked up several more crystal fragments from the fallen creature. They were still warm and pulsing with energy. If his theory was correct, each one was a potential weapon against the other dragons. As he prepared for the next attack, Jake realized something that both terrified and excited him. These creatures weren't just animals. They were sophisticated beings with their own technology and culture. The fact that they stored energy in crystal matrices suggested an advanced understanding of physics and engineering. If he could find a way to communicate with them instead of just fighting them, maybe he could learn something that would help him survive. But first, he had to deal with the pack of angry dragons that was about to emerge from the tunnels. The draconic guards came for Jake without warning. The cell door slid open, and 4 of the scaled creatures entered, carrying energy weapons that hummed with power. They were smaller than Commander Velthar, but no less frightening. Their eyes glowed the same angry red color. "Time to face your judgment, human," one of them hissed through its sharp teeth. Jake didn't resist as they bound his hands with metal restraints. Fighting would only get him stunned or killed before he even reached the pit. He needed to save his strength for whatever was waiting below. They marched him through the ship's corridors, past walls covered in those strange, moving symbols. Other draconic beings stopped their work to stare at him as he passed. Some of them laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Jake got the feeling that watching executions was entertainment for them. The ship's cargo bay had been converted into a ceremonial chamber. Hundreds of draconic soldiers stood in neat rows, all watching as Jake was led to the center of the room. Commander Velthar waited there, wearing different clothes now. His uniform was covered in golden symbols that seemed to burn with their own light. "Citizens of the Imperium," Velthar announced, his voice echoing through the bay. "Today we send another criminal to face the judgment of the Ancient Ones. Let this human's death remind all who would dare violate our sacred spaces." The crowd of soldiers cheered, a horrible sound that made Jake's ears ring. Velthar raised his hand for silence and continued speaking. "The great pit of Kethvar has held our enemies for 1,000 years. None have ever returned. The ancient dragons that dwell in its depths hunger for the flesh of those who would defile our holy places." Jake looked around the chamber, studying the faces of his captors. They truly believed they were doing something righteous. In their minds, he was a criminal who deserved death. It made him angry, but anger wouldn't help him survive what was coming. The guards removed his restraints and began stripping him of his equipment. They took his scanner, his radio, and his emergency supplies. But they were careless, more interested in the ceremony than in searching him thoroughly. They missed the small plasma cutter tucked into the side of his boot. When they were finished, Jake stood in the center of the chamber wearing only his basic clothes and boots. The plasma cutter was a tiny weight against his ankle, but it felt like his only hope. "Any last words, human?" Velthar asked, stepping closer. Jake looked the commander in the eyes. "Yeah, you're making a mistake." Velthar laughed, showing all his teeth. "The only mistake was yours when you entered our territory." The floor beneath Jake's feet suddenly opened. He had expected a trap door, but this was different. The metal floor simply folded away like liquid, creating a hole that showed only darkness below. Jake caught a glimpse of stone walls falling away into blackness before gravity took hold. He fell for what felt like forever. The opening above him became a tiny circle of light, then disappeared completely. The air grew cold and damp as he dropped through the darkness. Jake tried to position himself for landing, but he couldn't see anything below. When he finally hit something, it wasn't the hard stone floor he expected. Jake plunged into freezing water that knocked the breath from his lungs. The impact still hurt, but the underground lake saved his life. He sank deep into the dark water before fighting his way back to the surface. Jake gasped for air as his head broke through the water. The cold was shocking, but he was alive. He couldn't see anything in the complete darkness, so he felt around with his hands until he found what felt like a stone shore. Pulling himself out of the water, Jake collapsed on the rocky ground and shivered uncontrollably. His clothes were soaked and the air was cold enough to see his breath. If he didn't find warmth soon, he would die of exposure before any dragons found him. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Jake began to see faint light coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. It wasn't much, just a dim blue glow, but it was better than nothing. He squeezed water from his clothes and started walking toward the light. The cave was huge. His footsteps echoed off walls he couldn't see. The rocky floor was uneven and covered with loose stones that made walking dangerous. Several times Jake stumbled and nearly fell into what sounded like deep cracks in the ground. The blue light grew stronger as he walked. It seemed to come from some kind of fungus growing on the cave walls. The glowing plants gave off just enough light to see a few feet ahead. They also gave off a slight warmth that felt wonderful against Jake's cold skin. As he explored the cave system, Jake found signs that other creatures had been here before him. Scattered across the floor were bones of various sizes and shapes. Some looked like they came from the draconic soldiers, but others were completely alien. Jake counted at least 6 different species represented in the bone piles. Mixed in with the bones were pieces of equipment and weapons. Most of it was too corroded to be useful, but Jake found a few items that were still in good condition. An energy cell that still held some charge, a piece of metal that could work as a knife, a small device that might have been a communicator, though it was completely dead. The plasma cutter in his boot was still working, though it was damp from his fall into the lake. Jake tested it carefully and was relieved to see the thin beam of superheated energy cut through a piece of stone. The tool was designed for mining, but it could work as a weapon if necessary. Moving deeper into the cave, Jake found more evidence of the pit's history. Ancient carvings covered some of the walls, showing images of the draconic people throwing prisoners into the darkness. But the carvings also showed something else. Huge creatures with wings and claws, breathing energy instead of fire. These weren't the dragons from human stories. They looked more like living lightning, beings made of pure energy contained in crystalline bodies. The carvings showed them hunting and feeding on the life force of other creatures. Jake studied the images carefully, trying to understand what he was up against. The dragons in the carvings were massive, easily the size of the draconic ships. Their crystalline bodies seemed to channel and focus energy in ways that defied human science. But the carvings also showed something interesting. The dragons weren't just mindless beasts. They used tools and seemed to have their own culture. Some of the images showed them building structures and working with complex machinery. A sound echoed through the cave, making Jake freeze in place. It was a low humming noise, like the vibration of a massive engine. But there was something organic about it, like the sound was coming from a living thing. The blue glow from the fungus began to flicker and dim. Jake realized that something was coming, something big enough to affect the light-giving plants just by being near them. He quickly moved away from the wall carvings and looked for a place to hide. The humming grew louder and was joined by other sounds. The scraping of claws on stone, the whisper of something large moving through the air. And underneath it all, a crackling noise like electricity jumping between metal contacts. Jake pressed himself against a large boulder and tried to control his breathing. His heart was pounding so loud he was sure anything in the cave could hear it. The plasma cutter felt tiny and useless in his hand as the sounds grew closer. Whatever was coming, it was huge, powerful, and definitely not human. Jake was about to meet his first dragon, and he had no idea if he would survive the encounter. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he studied the energy readings on his scanner. The small device beeped softly in his hands, showing patterns he had never seen before. Strange blue light pulsed from deep inside the asteroid, creating waves of energy that made his equipment go crazy. He was a mining engineer from the outer colonies, sent here to check if this rock had anything valuable inside. Most asteroids were just empty stone and metal, but this one was different. The energy coming from it was unlike anything humans had discovered before. Jake moved closer to a crack in the asteroid's surface. The blue light grew brighter as he approached. His scanner started beeping faster and faster. Whatever was down there, it was powerful enough to light up his instruments from hundreds of feet away. "Control, this is Morrison," he said into his radio. "I'm getting some weird readings out here. This isn't just a regular asteroid." Static came back through his headset. He was too far from the colony ship to get a clear signal. Jake was on his own, just like he preferred it. He had always worked better alone, away from the noise and politics of the main colonies. He pulled out his drilling equipment and started making a small hole in the asteroid's surface. The rock was harder than normal stone, almost like it had metal mixed into it. As his drill bit deeper, the blue light grew brighter and his scanner went wild. Suddenly, the space around him exploded with light. Massive ships appeared out of nowhere, surrounding the asteroid. Jake looked up in shock as the vessels blocked out the stars. These weren't human ships. They were huge, black, and covered in sharp angles that hurt to look at. "Unknown vessel. You are trespassing in sacred territory," a voice boomed from the ships. The words came through his radio, but they sounded wrong, like the speaker had too many teeth. "Surrender immediately or face destruction." Jake's heart pounded as he looked at his small mining pod. It had no weapons and barely enough fuel to get back to the colony. Running wasn't an option. These alien ships could destroy him before he made it 10 feet. "This is Jake Morrison of the Human Colonial Mining Guild," he said into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't know this area belonged to anyone. I'm just here doing a survey." "Ignorance is not an excuse for violating the sacred spaces of the Draconic Imperium," the voice replied. "You will be taken for judgment." Before Jake could respond, a beam of energy hit his mining pod. All his systems shut down at once. His engines died, his lights went out, and even his life support started failing. The pod shook as something grabbed it from outside. Through his small window, Jake saw mechanical arms pulling his ship toward one of the larger vessels. The alien ship was even more frightening up close. Its hull was covered in symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. His pod was pulled into a cargo bay filled with strange equipment. The moment his ship touched down, the bay filled with a thick green gas. Jake held his breath as long as he could, but eventually he had to breathe. The gas tasted like metal and made his lungs burn. Within seconds, Jake felt dizzy and weak. His vision started to blur and his hands stopped working properly. The last thing he saw before passing out was a tall figure approaching his pod. It walked on 2 legs like a human, but it was covered in dark scales and had a head like a giant lizard. When Jake woke up, he was in a small metal cell. The walls were covered in the same moving symbols he had seen on the ship's hull. A dim red light came from somewhere above, but he couldn't see the source. His head hurt, and his mouth tasted like copper. The gas had left him feeling sick and confused. Jake tried to remember how long he had been unconscious, but time seemed meaningless in the windowless cell. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his cell. Jake stood up and moved away from the door as it slid open with a hiss. The creature that entered was even more frightening than the shadow he had seen before passing out. It stood nearly 8 feet tall and was covered in black scales that reflected the red light. Its head was long and narrow, like a crocodile's, but it stood upright and wore what looked like military clothing. When it opened its mouth to speak, Jake saw rows of sharp teeth. "Human," the creature said in that same voice from the radio. "I am Commander Velthar of the Draconic Imperium. You have committed a grave crime by entering our sacred territory." Jake tried to speak, but his throat was still raw from the gas. He coughed and tried again. "I didn't know it was your territory. There were no warning signs, no broadcasts. My people had no idea anyone claimed that space." Commander Velthar's eyes glowed like hot coals in the dim light. "Your ignorance matters nothing. The asteroid you were violating contains one of our most holy sites. The punishment for such desecration is death." "Death?" Jake's voice cracked. "For taking energy readings? I didn't even take anything." "You disturbed the resting place of the Ancient Ones," Velthar said, moving closer to the cell bars. "For this crime, you will be thrown into the great pit of Kethvar, where our ancestors will decide your fate." Jake had never heard of the Great Pit, but the way the alien said it made his blood run cold. "What's in this pit?" Velthar's mouth curved into what might have been a smile, showing even more teeth. "Dragons, human, ancient dragons that have not fed in many cycles. They are always hungry for fresh meat." The commander turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Jake. "No creature has ever survived the pit. Your death will serve as a warning to any other humans who think they can trespass in our territory." After Velthar left, Jake sat alone in his cell, trying to process what had just happened. One moment he was doing a routine survey, and now he was facing execution by being fed to dragons. The worst part was that his colony ship would never know what happened to him. They would just assume his pod had broken down in space. Jake looked around his cell, searching for anything that might help him escape. The walls were solid metal with no visible weak points. The door had no handle on the inside. Even the air vent was too small to crawl through. But Jake Morrison hadn't survived 15 years of mining in dangerous space by giving up easily. As he examined every inch of his prison, his mind was already working on a plan. If they were going to throw him to the dragons, he would make sure he was ready for them. Jake crouched behind a pile of fallen rocks, watching 3 more dragons emerge from the tunnels. These creatures moved differently than the first one. They were more cautious, more coordinated. They had learned from their companion's death and were treating Jake as a real threat instead of easy prey. The dragons spread out to surround the lake area, their crystalline bodies pulsing with contained energy. Jake could see them communicating with each other through flashes of light that passed between their forms. It was like watching a conversation conducted entirely in electrical signals. He studied their movements and began to notice patterns. These weren't just predators hunting for food. They were intelligent beings using tactics and strategy. The way they positioned themselves showed military-level planning and coordination. Jake examined the crystal fragments he had collected from the dead dragon. Each piece contained a different type of energy pattern. Some pulsed rapidly with high frequency discharges, while others glowed with steady, low-frequency power. It was like having a collection of different types of batteries, each one designed for a specific purpose. Using his engineering knowledge, Jake began to understand what he was looking at. These creatures weren't just alive. They were living. Machines, biological beings that had evolved or been designed to manipulate energy in ways human science barely understood. The dragons began their attack, but this time they worked together. One creature drew Jake's attention with small energy blasts, while the other 2 moved to flank him. It was a smart strategy that showed they had analyzed his previous tactics. Jake threw one of the crystal fragments at the lead dragon, but the creature was ready for him. It deflected the fragment with an energy shield, sending it bouncing harmlessly off the cave wall. The dragons had adapted to his weapon already. Retreating deeper into the cave system, Jake found himself in a section filled with ancient machinery. The walls were covered with the same symbols he had seen on the draconic ship, but these were older and more complex. Some of the symbols seemed to respond to his presence, glowing faintly as he passed. The machinery was unlike anything from human or draconic technology. It was organic-looking, with curved surfaces that seemed to flow like living tissue. But it was clearly artificial, built with precision and purpose that spoke of advanced engineering. Jake realized he was looking at dragon technology. These creatures had once been the builders of this equipment, the original engineers of energy, manipulation systems that the draconic Imperium had never fully understood. One piece of machinery caught his attention. It was a large console covered in crystal panels that pulsed with dormant energy. The design was similar to the dragon's own bodies, suggesting it was meant to interface directly with their crystalline forms. Jake heard the dragons approaching, through the tunnels behind him. He didn't have time to study the machinery properly, but he could see that it was connected to the cave's power systems. Energy conduits ran from the console into the walls and floor, spreading throughout the entire cavern system. An idea formed in his mind. If this console controlled the cave's energy systems, and if the dragons were essentially energy-based life forms, then maybe he could use their own infrastructure against them. Jake pulled out his plasma cutter and began carefully cutting into one of the energy conduits. The moment his beam touched the crystal-lined tube, feedback energy shot up his arm. The conduit was still active, still carrying power through the cave's systems. The dragons burst into the chamber just as Jake made his breakthrough. The severed conduit began leaking energy in all directions, creating a light show that temporarily blinded the approaching creatures. Jake used the distraction to move to another part of the console. Working frantically, he began connecting the crystal fragments from the dead dragon to the ancient machinery. The fragments fit into slots on the console like they were designed for it. As each piece locked into place, new sections of the machinery came to life. The dragons realized what he was doing and attacked with desperate intensity. Energy blasts shattered rocks all around Jake as he worked. One blast came so close it singed his hair, but he kept working. He was close to something important. The last crystal fragment slotted into place, and the entire console blazed with power. Suddenly, Jake could feel the energy network that ran through the entire cave system. It was like plugging into the nervous system of a vast living organism. Through the network, Jake sensed other dragons throughout the cave complex. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all connected to the same energy grid, but something was wrong with the system. It was running at a fraction of its designed capacity, slowly dying from lack of proper maintenance. The three dragons in the chamber with him had stopped attacking. They were staring at the activated console with what Jake could only describe as amazement. Light patterns flowed across their crystalline bodies in sequences he had never seen before. One of the dragons approached the console slowly, its energy tendrils reaching out to touch the activated machinery. The moment it made contact, information flooded through the energy network directly into Jake's mind. He saw the history of the dragon race in flashes of memory and emotion. They had once ruled a vast interstellar civilization, masters of energy, manipulation, and crystal technology. Their ships had traveled between stars using power sources that human science couldn't even imagine. But something had gone wrong. A younger race had learned to use their technology without understanding it. The newcomers had enslaved the dragons, trapping them in facilities like this cave and using them as living power sources for stolen technology. Jake realized with shock that the younger race was the Draconic Imperium. The scaled aliens who had captured him were descendants of primitives who had overthrown their dragon masters thousands of years ago. The Great Pit wasn't a prison for criminals. It was a concentration camp for the original rulers of this part of the galaxy. The dragon connected to the console was trying to communicate with him. Images and concepts flowed through the energy link, showing Jake the truth about his situation. The dragons were dying out, their population reduced to a few hundred scattered across dozens of pit facilities throughout the Imperium. But Jake's activation of the ancient console had given them something they hadn't had in centuries: hope. The machinery was designed to enhance and sustain dragon life forms, but it had been deliberately sabotaged by the draconic conquerors. With human engineering knowledge and adaptability, it might be possible to repair the damage. The dragon showed Jake plans and schematics that existed only in its crystalline memory banks. Technologies that could revolutionize energy production, space travel, and even biological enhancement. But the knowledge was incomplete, damaged by centuries of improper maintenance and deliberate sabotage. Jake understood what the dragon was asking of him. It wasn't offering him a quick death or even freedom. It was offering partnership. The dragons needed human ingenuity and engineering skills to restore their civilization. In return, they could offer technologies that would make humanity a major power in the galaxy. But first, they had to survive long enough to make it work. The cave's energy systems were failing, and the Draconic Imperium would eventually notice that something had changed in the pit. They needed to work fast and work together. Jake looked at the three dragons surrounding him and made his decision. Instead of trying to escape or fight his way out, he would stay and help them restore their ancient technology. It was dangerous and probably impossible, but it was also the most important engineering project in galactic history. He placed his hand on the console and opened his mind to the energy network. Information flowed between human and dragon consciousness, sharing knowledge and capabilities that neither species possessed alone. For the first time since being thrown into the pit, Jake felt like he might actually survive this experience. More than that, he felt like he might be about to change the course of galactic history. Working with the dragons was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The three creatures had names, though they were more like energy signatures than words. The largest one, which Jake mentally called Spark, seemed to be their leader. The other two, who he named Pulse and Arc, were younger but equally intelligent. Through the energy network, Jake learned that these dragons had been trapped in the pit for over 200 years. They had watched countless prisoners thrown into their domain, all of them eventually dying from the harsh conditions, or becoming food for the weaker dragons who had given up hope of ever escaping. But Spark and his companions had never stopped, believing they could restore their people's freedom. They had kept the ancient machinery partially functional through careful maintenance, waiting for someone with the right combination of knowledge and determination to help them complete the repairs. Jake spent hours studying the dragon technology through the energy link. Their engineering was based on principles human science had never discovered. Instead of using crude mechanical systems, they manipulated matter and energy at the molecular level using crystalline structures that could store and channel power with perfect efficiency. The console Jake had activated was just one part of a vast network that had once connected dragon colonies across multiple star systems. Each installation was designed to support thousands of dragons and maintain their crystalline life forms in perfect health for millennia. But the Draconic Imperium had systematically destroyed most of the network after conquering the dragon civilization. The remaining installations, like this cave, had been converted into prisons where dragons were kept barely alive to serve as living batteries for stolen technology. Jake learned that his plasma cutter had been effective against the first dragon, because its energy matrix was already damaged from centuries of malnutrition and poor maintenance. Healthy dragons were nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, their crystalline bodies able to absorb and redirect most forms of energy. Working together, Jake and the dragons began repairing the cave's energy systems. Jake's human engineering knowledge proved invaluable for solving problems that the dragons couldn't handle alone. Where they understood the theoretical principles perfectly, Jake could provide practical solutions for bypassing damaged systems and jury-rigging repairs. Work was dangerous and exhausting. The ancient machinery operated on power levels that could kill a human instantly if handled incorrectly. Several times Jake nearly electrocuted himself when his inexperience with dragon technology led to feedback surges through the energy network. But slowly, the cave began to come alive. Systems that had been dormant for centuries started functioning again. The glowing fungus on the walls brightened as more power flowed through the biological energy conduits. Hidden chambers opened throughout the cave complex, revealing equipment and resources that had been sealed away. Jake discovered that the dragons weren't the only intelligent species imprisoned in the cave. In the deeper chambers, he found beings from a dozen different races, all of them weak and dying from the same energy malnutrition that was killing the dragons. Some of the prisoners had been there for decades, kept alive by the minimal energy. The dragons could spare from their own dwindling reserves. They were all species that the draconic Imperium considered threats to their expansion, political prisoners and scientists who had opposed the dragon enslavement. Among the prisoners, Jake found Dr. Lisa Park, a human xenobiologist who had been captured while studying energy-based life forms in a distant system. She had been in the pit for 3 years and was barely conscious when Jake found her. "You're human," Dr. Park whispered when Jake revived her with energy from the restored systems. "How did you get here? Are there others?" Jake explained his situation while helping her back to health. Dr. Park's knowledge of alien biology proved crucial for understanding how the energy restoration systems affected different species. Together, they worked to modify the machinery, to safely treat all the prisoners. As more of the cave's systems came online, Jake began to understand the true scope of what the dragons were asking him to help them accomplish. This wasn't just about escaping from one prison. They wanted to restore their entire civilization and reclaim their rightful place in the galaxy. The dragons showed Jake memory recordings of their golden age, cities that floated between stars, powered by crystalline technology that made them almost godlike in their capabilities. Ships that could cross galactic distances in hours using energy manipulation techniques that bypassed the normal limitations of physics. But they also showed him what the draconic conquest had cost them: billions of dragons killed or enslaved. Entire worlds stripped of their energy sources and left as barren rocks. A civilization that had spent millions of years developing sustainable technologies reduced to a few hundred survivors scattered across prison facilities. Spark explained that the dragons' greatest weakness had been their peaceful nature. They had no experience with warfare or conquest because their advanced technology had eliminated scarcity and competition within their society. When the primitive draconic tribes had learned to use captured dragon weapons, the dragons had been completely unprepared for systematic genocide. Jake felt a growing anger as he learned more about the dragons' history. The Draconic Imperium had built their entire civilization on stolen technology and enslaved labor. Everything from their faster-than-light travel to their energy weapons was based on dragon innovations that they didn't truly understand. Working with Dr. Park and the dragons, Jake began developing a plan that went far beyond simple escape. If they could restore enough of the ancient network to contact other dragon survivors, they might be able to coordinate a rebellion that could topple the Imperium. The key was the energy signature modification system that Jake had accidentally activated. By broadcasting the right frequency patterns through the Dragon network, they could awaken dormant systems in other prison facilities and provide power to dragons who had been too weak to resist their captors. But the plan required more power than their current installation could generate. They needed to access the main energy core that lay deep beneath the cave, in chambers that had been sealed since the original conquest. Jake and Spark descended through ancient tunnels that led to the heart of the mountain. The walls were covered with crystalline growths that pulsed with stored energy, creating a light show that was both beautiful and terrifying. The power levels here were astronomical, enough to supply an entire planet's energy needs. At the center of the complex, they found the main core chamber. It was a vast, spherical room with a crystalline structure at its center that looked like a frozen star. Energy flowed through it in patterns too complex for human eyes to follow, creating a constant display of shifting lights and colors. The core was still functional, but it was operating at less than 1% of its design capacity. Centuries of improper maintenance by draconic technicians had left it crippled and unstable. Jake realized that restoring it to full power would be the most challenging engineering project he had ever attempted, but if he succeeded, they would have enough energy to contact every dragon facility in the galaxy and coordinate a simultaneous uprising that the Draconic Imperium could never stop. Jake looked at the massive crystalline core and felt both excitement and terror. In his hands lay the power to reshape the galaxy and restore justice to a civilization that had been wronged for far too long. The question was whether he could master technology so advanced that it seemed like magic, and whether he could do it before the Draconic Imperium discovered what was happening in their most secure prison. Restoring the main energy core was like trying to repair a star while it was still burning. Jake had to work inside the crystalline matrix itself, surrounded by energy discharges that could vaporize him if he made a single mistake. The dragons guided him through the energy network, but the actual repair work required human hands and human intuition. Jake spent days studying the core's structure before attempting any repairs. The crystalline formation was incredibly complex, with millions of energy pathways flowing through geometric patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Some of the damage was obvious, sections where energy was leaking or flowing in the wrong directions, but other problems were subtle, requiring Jake to understand how the entire system was supposed to function. Dr. Park proved invaluable as a research partner. Her knowledge of alien biology helped her understand how the core interfaced with dragon physiology. She discovered that the core wasn't just a power source. It was designed to enhance and sustain dragon life forms, extending their natural lifespans and increasing their energy manipulation abilities. Working together, Jake and Dr. Park developed a repair plan that would restore the core's functionality in stages. They couldn't fix everything at once without risking a catastrophic power surge that would destroy the entire facility. Instead, they would bring each section online gradually, testing and adjusting as they went. The first stage involved bypassing the damaged regulation systems that had been keeping the core running at minimal power. Jake had to physically enter the crystalline matrix and rewire energy conduits while the system was active. The work was incredibly dangerous, requiring him to wear a specially modified suit that Dr. Park had improvised from dragon technology. As Jake worked inside the core, he began to understand why the dragons considered this technology sacred. The energy patterns weren't just functional, they were beautiful, creating harmonics and resonances that affected consciousness itself. Working within the matrix felt like being inside a living song, a symphony of power and purpose that had been playing for millions of years. The dragons watched his progress through the energy network, offering guidance and encouragement. Jake learned that no dragon had entered the core chamber in over 500 years. The last engineers who understood its operation had been killed during the original conquest, and the surviving dragons had lacked the knowledge to attempt major repairs. When Jake successfully restored the first energy regulation system, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Power levels throughout the cave increased by over 300%, and dragons who had been barely conscious for decades began to stir with new strength. The glowing fungus on the cave walls blazed with renewed light, and dormant machinery throughout the complex hummed back to life. But the power increase also triggered automated systems that the dragons had forgotten existed. Ancient defensive. Protocols activated, sealing the main access tunnels and preparing to repel intruders. For several terrifying hours, Jake and his companions were trapped in the core chamber while automated systems decided whether they were authorized to be there. Spark eventually managed to convince the ancient security systems that they were legitimate users rather than draconic invaders. The process required him to provide authorization codes that had been locked in his genetic memory since birth. Jake realized he was witnessing the awakening of a computer system that was older than human civilization. With the first stage of repairs complete, Jake began working on the core's communication systems. These were the components that would allow them to contact other dragon facilities across the galaxy. But restoring the communication array required modifications that went beyond simple repair work. The original system had been designed for a galaxy controlled by dragon civilization. It assumed that all receiving stations would be operated by trained dragon technicians using standardized equipment, but the prison facilities operated by the Draconic Imperium use corrupted and modified dragon technology that might not be compatible with the restored systems. Jake had to redesign the communication protocols to work with the degraded systems in other facilities. This meant creating entirely new software using crystalline programming techniques that human computer science had never developed. He had to think in terms of energy patterns and harmonic frequencies rather than traditional binary code. Dr. Park helped by analyzing samples of dragon crystal matrix to understand how information was stored and processed. She discovered that dragon technology used a form of quantum crystalline memory that could store vast amounts of data in perfect preservation for millions of years. As they worked, more prisoners throughout the facility began to recover their strength. The restored energy systems were healing decades of malnutrition and decay in a matter of days. Jake found himself leading a growing community of freed prisoners, all of them eager to help with the restoration project. Among the recovered prisoners was Commander Ruth Collins, a human military officer who had been captured during a border skirmish with the Draconic Imperium. She had been in the pit for 5 years and possessed valuable knowledge about draconic military capabilities and tactics. Commander Collins helped Jake understand the strategic implications of what they were attempting. If they succeeded in awakening the dragon facilities throughout the galaxy, they would be starting a war that could last for centuries. The Draconic Imperium would not give up their enslaved dragons without a fight, but Collins also pointed out that the dragons might be the galaxy's only hope for freedom from draconic expansion. The Imperium had been systematically conquering and enslaving every species they encountered for over 1,000 years. Only a force with superior technology and motivation could stop them. Jake completed the second stage of repairs after a week of intensive work. The core's power output increased to nearly 50% of its design capacity, and the communication systems came online for the first time in centuries. The moment the array activated, signals began flooding in from across the galaxy. There were more dragon facilities than anyone had realized. The dragons had been systematically imprisoned on dozens of worlds, their populations kept deliberately small and weak to prevent any possibility of organized resistance. But the facilities were all connected to the same ancient network, and the restored communications system could reach them all. Jake and Spark worked together to compose the first message that would be sent through the network in over 500 years. It was both a greeting to the scattered dragon survivors and a call to revolution that would change the galaxy forever. The message contained technical specifications for the repairs Jake had developed, allowing dragons in other facilities to begin restoring their own energy systems. It also included strategic information about draconic military weaknesses that Commander Collins had provided. When they finally transmitted the message, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Dragon facilities across the galaxy began responding, their ancient communication systems awakening from centuries of silence. Jake realized he was witnessing the resurrection of a civilization that had been thought extinct. But he also knew that their activities would not go unnoticed for long. The Draconic Imperium monitored their prison facilities, and the sudden increase in energy signatures would eventually attract attention. They had perhaps days or weeks before draconic forces arrived to investigate. Jake looked at the fully functional communication array and felt both pride and terror. He had given the dragons the tools they needed to reclaim their freedom, but he had also started a war that would reshape the galaxy. There was no going back now. The response from dragon facilities across the galaxy exceeded Jake's wildest expectations. Within hours of sending their message, over 300 installations had responded with confirmation that they were beginning restoration procedures. The ancient network was coming alive after centuries of silence, and with it, the dragon race was awakening from its forced hibernation. Jake worked frantically to coordinate the uprising from the main communications center. Each facility faced different challenges based on how severely their systems had been damaged and how many guards the Draconic Imperium had stationed there. Some installations had only a handful of weakened dragons remaining, while others housed hundreds of prisoners from multiple species. Spark and the other dragons took on the role of military coordinators, using their connection to the network to direct strategy across dozens of star systems simultaneously. Their ability to communicate instantly through quantum-entangled crystal matrices gave them an enormous advantage over conventional military communications. Dr. Park and Commander Collins worked together to analyze intelligence reports coming in from the freed facilities. They discovered that the Draconic Imperium's expansion had slowed dramatically in recent decades, not because of any change in policy, but because their stolen dragon technology was beginning to fail. The Draconic engineers had never truly understood the principles behind dragon energy manipulation. They had simply copied existing designs without grasping the underlying science. After centuries of use without proper maintenance, their ships and weapons were becoming increasingly unreliable. Jake realized this gave them a crucial opportunity. If they could coordinate their uprising to strike while the draconic military was dealing with widespread equipment failures, they might be able to achieve victory with minimal casualties. But first, they had to deal with the immediate threat approaching their own facility. Long-range sensors showed a draconic battle fleet moving toward their location, probably sent to investigate the sudden energy surges coming from the supposedly inactive prison. Commander Collins estimated they had less than 2 days before the fleet arrived. Jake knew they needed to complete the final stage of the core restoration before then. At full power, the ancient facility's defensive systems would be more than capable of dealing with a few draconic ships. The final restoration phase required Jake to make fundamental changes to the core's operating principles. The original system had been designed for a peaceful civilization that had never needed to prepare for warfare. Jake had to modify the energy output systems to power weapons and defensive shields that hadn't been activated in thousands of years. Working inside the crystalline matrix at full power levels was exponentially more dangerous than the earlier repairs. The energy discharges were now powerful enough to kill him instantly if he touched the wrong component. Jake had to rely entirely on the dragon's guidance through the network, trusting them to guide his hands when he couldn't see clearly through the blinding energy displays. As he worked, Jake began to understand the true scope of what the dragons had built. This wasn't just a single facility. It was a node in a galactic defense network that had once protected dozens of star systems. The weapon systems he was activating could destroy entire fleets or defend against planet-killing attacks. The dragons had built their civilization to last forever, with redundant systems and fail-safes that ensured their technology could survive any conceivable disaster. But they had never imagined a threat that came from within, a conquered slave race that would turn their own tools against them. Jake completed the weapon system restoration just hours before the draconic fleet arrived. The moment the systems came online, he felt the facility's true power for the first time. Energy levels that could reshape matter at the atomic level flowed through crystalline conduits designed to channel forces that could move planets. The draconic fleet consisted of 12 heavy warships, armed with the most advanced weapons the Imperium possessed. Under normal circumstances, they would have been more than capable of destroying any resistance from a prison facility. But Commander Velthar, who led the fleet personally, had no idea what he was facing. His sensors showed impossible energy, readings coming from the pit facility, power levels that exceeded anything in the draconic arsenal. He assumed his equipment was malfunctioning. When Velthar's fleet moved into attack position, Jake was ready for them. The facility's defensive systems had been designed to protect against threats the draconic Imperium couldn't even imagine. Ancient weapon arrays emerged from hidden chambers in the asteroid's surface, focusing energy beams that could cut through any known armor. The battle was over in minutes. The draconic ships, armed with weapons based on corrupted dragon technology, were completely outmatched by the original systems operating at full power. Their energy shields collapsed instantly under the defensive fire, and their hulls were sliced apart by beams that moved at near-light speed. Commander Velthar's flagship was the last to fall. Jake watched through the facility's sensors as the proud draconic officer realized that everything his civilization believed about their technological superiority was a lie. The primitive humans and the defeated dragons had just demonstrated power that made the entire draconic fleet look like toys. But Jake took no satisfaction in the victory. Each destroyed ship represented hundreds of lives lost, and he knew this was just the beginning of a war that would consume the galaxy. He had given the dragons the power to reclaim their freedom, but freedom always came with a price in blood. Across the galaxy, similar battles were beginning as dragon facilities threw off their chains and struck back at their draconic oppressors. The reports flooding through the network told of prison ships destroyed, slave camps liberated, and ancient dragon colonies reclaimed from their conquerors. But the reports also told of draconic retaliation. Civilian populations were being targeted in revenge attacks. Entire worlds that harbored freed dragons were being bombarded from orbit. The Imperium was willing to destroy everything rather than accept the loss of their enslaved power sources. Jake realized that victory in the war would require more than just military superiority. They needed to win the hearts and minds of the galaxy's other species, convincing them that a restored dragon civilization would be better than continued draconic rule. Standing in the main control chamber, surrounded by the energy flows of a fully restored dragon facility, Jake felt the weight of galactic history settling on his shoulders. He had started something that would reshape the political structure of known space. The dragons were offering him a choice. He could remain with them as humanity's first ambassador to the restored dragon civilization, helping to forge an alliance that would ensure both species' survival. Or he could return to human space to prepare his own people for the changes that were coming. Jake looked at Spark, whose crystalline form now blazed with the full power of his restored heritage. Through the energy link, he could feel the gratitude of hundreds of dragon survivors and thousands of freed prisoners across the galaxy. The choice was easy. Jake Morrison had come to this asteroid as a simple mining engineer looking for energy sources. He would leave as humanity's representative to the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, carrying knowledge that would change the course of human history forever. But first, they had a war to win. 6 months after the liberation of the dragon facilities began, Jake stood on the bridge of the Void Walker, a living ship that was part crystal matrix and part organic neural network. The vessel had grown around him over the past months, bonding with his human biology in ways that still amazed the dragon engineers. Through his neural link with Spark, who now served as the ship's primary consciousness, Jake could feel the pulse of the galactic war that raged across hundreds of star systems. The conflict had evolved far beyond simple prison breaks and revenge attacks. It had become a fundamental struggle over the future direction of galactic civilization. The dragons had proven to be everything Jake had hoped and more. Once freed from their energy-starved prisons, they had revealed technological capabilities that made the draconic Imperium's stolen weapons look primitive. Ships that could phase in and out of normal space, weapons that manipulated matter at the quantum level, and defensive systems that could protect entire solar systems. But the dragons had also proven to be surprisingly reluctant conquerors. Despite their overwhelming technological advantages, they showed no interest in simply replacing the draconic Imperium with their own empire. Instead, they offered liberation and partnership to any species willing to reject draconic rule. Jake had become the primary liaison between the Dragon Alliance and the dozens of species that were joining their cause. His unique ability to interface with both human and dragon consciousness made him invaluable as a translator of concepts that neither species could have understood alone. Commander Collins, now serving as the human military advisor to the Dragon fleet, approached Jake as he studied the latest tactical reports. The news was mixed. They were winning the war militarily, but the cost in civilian casualties was growing every day. The Draconic High Command has issued another ultimatum, Collins reported. They're threatening to destroy the core worlds of any species that continues to support our alliance. They've already started bombarding civilian targets in the Centauri system. Jake felt a surge of anger through his link with Spark. The dragons had never forgotten what it was like to watch their own civilian populations slaughtered by draconic forces. They wanted to respond with overwhelming force, but Jake had convinced them that civilian casualties would only turn potential allies against their cause. "What's our response?" Jake asked, though he already knew what they had to do. "We protect the civilians first," Spark's voice resonated through the ship's communication system, "even if it means giving the draconic military time to regroup." This was the fundamental difference between the Dragon Alliance and the Draconic Imperium. The dragons remembered what it was like to be victims, and they refused to become the oppressors they had once fought against. It made them morally superior to their enemies, but it also made the war much more difficult to win. Jake had spent months developing strategies that would minimize civilian casualties while still achieving military objectives. The dragons' ability to manipulate space and time gave them options that conventional military thinking couldn't imagine, but it required careful coordination to execute properly. The latest operation was typical of their approach. Instead of simply destroying the draconic fleet that was threatening the Centauri colonies, they would phase the entire enemy force into a pocket dimension where they could be safely contained until the war ended. Jake interfaced directly with the ship's navigation system as they approached the battle zone. Through Spark's consciousness, he could feel the fabric of space-time itself, sensing the gravitational currents and quantum fluctuations that the dragons used for faster-than-light travel. The draconic fleet was exactly where intelligence reports had indicated, 12 star destroyers in formation around the main civilian population center, preparing to begin orbital bombardment. Their commanders probably thought they were safe, protected by shields and weapons that represented the pinnacle of stolen dragon technology. But Jake and Spark had learned to work together in ways that neither humans nor dragons had ever achieved, alone. Jake's human intuition for tactical innovation combined with Spark's vast computational abilities and energy manipulation powers created possibilities that neither species could have imagined separately. The Void Walker phased into normal, space directly above the draconic fleet. For a moment, both human and dragon consciousness merged completely as they initiated the dimensional displacement protocol. Reality bent around them as they opened a gateway to an empty pocket dimension and began drawing the enemy ships through. The draconic commanders had only seconds to realize what was happening before their entire fleet was pulled through the dimensional gateway. 12 massive warships vanished from normal space without firing a single shot, trapped in a reality bubble where they could do no harm to anyone. It was a perfect victory. The threat eliminated without a single casualty on either side. The Centauri colonies were safe, and even the draconic crews would survive in their pocket dimension until the war ended and they could be released. But Jake knew that such perfect solutions weren't always possible. The war was entering its final phase, and soon they would have to confront the Draconic Imperium's ultimate stronghold, the homeworld where the dragon genocide had begun over 1,000 years ago. Dr. Park's voice came through the ship's communication system from her laboratory deep within the vessel's crystal matrix. "Jake, you need to see what we've discovered about the draconic homeworld. The analysis of their quantum signatures suggests they've been using dragon technology for something much worse than we imagined." Jake and Spark descended through the ship's living corridors to Dr. Park's research facility. Over the months, she had developed new techniques for analyzing alien technology that combined human scientific methodology with dragon quantum perception abilities. What she showed them was horrifying beyond anything they had encountered so far. The draconic homeworld wasn't just powered by enslaved dragon technology, it was literally consuming dragon consciousness to maintain its existence. The planet itself had been converted into a massive life support system that required the death of hundreds of dragons every year. "They're not just using our technology," Spark said, his crystalline form flickering with rage. "They're feeding on our life force to power their entire civilization." Jake studied the data, trying to understand the implications. If the dragon's homeworld was destroyed, it would free the consciousness of millions of dragons who had been trapped in the planet's matrix for centuries. But it would also mean the death of billions of draconic civilians who were innocent of their government's crimes. The final battle of the war would force them to choose between justice and mercy, between the liberation of dragon souls and the preservation of innocent life. Jake realized that his role as humanity's ambassador to the dragons had prepared him for this moment. He would have to help them find a third option that honored both their need for justice and their commitment to protecting innocent life. Standing in the heart of a living ship powered by willing partnership between human and dragon consciousness, Jake felt the weight of galactic history in his hands. The war that had begun with his fall into a pit full of supposedly extinct dragons was about to end with a decision that would determine the moral foundation of the new galactic civilization. The dragons were offering humanity a partnership that would last for millennia, sharing technology and wisdom that would transform human civilization beyond recognition. But they were also asking humans to help them navigate the moral complexities of victory, to find ways to claim justice without becoming the monsters their enemies had been. Jake Morrison had entered the dragon pit as a prisoner facing certain death. He would emerge as the architect of a new galactic order, carrying the hopes and dreams of every species that yearned for freedom from oppression. The boy who had been thrown to the dragons had learned to speak their language. Now he would teach the galaxy how to listen,